Welcome to Forthright. I'm Sue Lonnie Madsen, bringing you an audio podcast of my weekly newspaper column, this one written the day after the Washington primary election. My assignment for the Spokesman Review is to provide rural and conservative balance to the opinion page, and my editor has a preference for local or regional issues, since there are plenty of syndicated columns covering national issues. There are no restrictions on my choice of column topics, and since I had spent the night before this column was due buried in refreshing the Secretary of State's website for election results, the topic for that week was obvious. Selecting headlines is the editor's prerogative, but I do usually provide helpful suggestions. They set the context in shaping how the writer is perceived by the reader, and I suggested the first half, thinking of Shakespeare's famous quote about a rose, and my editor added the second. What I really meant was what's in a label, but onto the column, headlined, "What's in a Name? Not Necessarily the Votes." As published August 8, 2024 in the Spokesman Review, politics has always relied on shorthand descriptors to identify candidates in a crowded field. For the Seattle Times, the top two candidates for governor in the now less crowded field on the day after the primary were described as a, quote, former ranked chess champion, end quote, against a, quote, former brawny sheriff, end quote. Former sheriff is a legitimate reference to Dave Reichert's first elected office as King County Sheriff. Spokesman Review writers also referred to Reichert as a former sheriff, but skipped the middle schoolish egghead versus jock characterization of the Seattle Times. Candidate Bob Ferguson is simply identified as the current Attorney General in the Spokesman Review. It's a post Ferguson has held for 12 years, which makes him part of the status quo of the current state of public safety in Washington, but I digress. Back to Shakespeare's question of what's in a name and how some labels smell sweeter than others. The Spokesman Review had more robust coverage than Seattle's last remaining daily paper of other statewide races, as well as covering Eastern Washington's legislative and congressional results. No weird adjectives appeared in this paper's straight reporting. Occupational labels were the most common for those who don't currently hold elected office, like insurance professional, attorney, law student, businessman, cattle rancher, judge, Kaiser Aluminum employee, physician. Candidates retired from one career and looking for another were identified by former occupations, including diplomat, scientist, energy professional, attorney, Army veteran. There's a lot of attorneys besides the two finalists for the next Attorney General. Maybe too many attorneys. We need more diversity and inclusion of other professions in the state legislature and in Congress. Then there's the labels used between factions within political parties. Purists in both parties have been known to use the derisive acronyms Dino and Rhino to describe anyone who isn't sufficiently progressive, and therefore a Democrat in name only, or a conservative, and must be a Republican in name only. You won't find many dinos on the east side of the state, where Democrats are nearly extinct, given their scarceness in legislative or congressional seats. Gubernatorial candidate State Senator Mark Mullet, Democrat of Issaquah, has been described as a dino, or maybe it's Dino, and it dogged him into his distant fourth-place race showing for governor. Former school board member Semi Bird finished third with less than 10% of the vote statewide as of Wednesday morning. Some of his disappointed fans have been calling Reichert a rhino for months. Overcoming the name-calling will be critical for a party seeking to overturn 40 years of Democratic dominance in the executive branch. Washington State's primary voters selected a proven-to-be progressive Democrat and a sometimes more moderate Republican to advance to the general election for governor. The real Republicans in name only will be the ones who refuse to support the only Republican in the top two. The question is whether Republicans manage to pitch a big enough tent to hold the base, plus attract independent voters who disdain all partisan politics. No partisan labels to guide voters in the Commissioner of Public Lands race, where it looks like two Republican women will advance to the general. It really should be a nonpartisan office focused on sound land management, balancing economic return for the benefit of public education and forest health, in addition to operating the largest fire response service in the state. Both candidates are well qualified. Sue Cole Peterson is a former fisheries biologist who has a relevant science background. Former Representative Jamie Herrera Beutler has the legislative negotiation background. They'd make a good team with their complementary skill sets. Cole Peterson has no political baggage. Herrera Beutler does, although her vote on the Trump impeachment in January 2021 is not relevant to forest management. It would be refreshing to have a race that could be solely focused on policy and qualifications instead of identity labels. Herrera Butler, along with Dr. Raul Garcia for U.S. Senate, also represents the 2024 surge of Hispanic candidates for office. Hispanic voters in the 14th Legislative District are a particular focus after a federal judge scrambled the map adopted by Washington's Bipartisan Redistricting Commission. Judge Lasnik made the decision based on evidence from an expert selected by Ferguson that Hispanic voters are better represented by Democrats. The district was redrawn by the plaintiffs to favor Democrats. Turns out voters in the 14th District didn't get the memo. Experienced State Senator Rufus King, Republican of Yakima, who moved about a half mile to stay in the district, led Democratic activist Maria Beltran 57.46% to 42.32% on Wednesday morning. Republican CPA and family farmer Dev Manyares led second-place Democratic activist Ana Ruiz Kennedy 52.91% to 40.07%. And the combined Republican vote for park ranger Andy Callanan and business owner Gloria Mendoza is 62.15% over second-place Democratic activist Chelsea Dimas. Dimas will face Mendoza in the general election. Turns out Ferguson's expert was wrong. Republican votes in the Yakima area weren't all about party labels after all. Washington voters have a strong independent streak. Okay, one of the problems of reading a column is that I am sure I have butchered at least somebody's name in that in trying to get those names all pronounced correctly. So I apologize to anyone whose name I have mispronounced. There are a few updates. For one, the Commissioner of Public Lands race may come down to a hand recount. Dave Up the Grove pulls slightly ahead of Sue Peterson after more of King County's ballots were tallied later in the week. On the other hand, Republicans are chasing down ballots of likely Republican voters that were rejected for lack of signature match or other flaws that can be cured following the process out in the statute in a couple of different legislative district races. More Republican ballots are coming in, could flip that Commissioner of Public Lands back to a two Republican race. We'll have to wait and see. Keep hitting refresh on the election results. You can check the status of your ballot and the ballot of anybody whose proper name and birthday you know at votewa.gov and see if it needs to be cured. One year I forgot to sign the outside of the envelope, and I got a postcard from my county elections office, and all I had to do was go in and sign for it. Check it out and make sure that your ballot counted. As always, reference links are included on the Substack post to this week's background reading, including a link to votewa.gov. You are invited to subscribe for notifications of new content on a variety of regional topics, with or without a pledge. Lots of free content, although I will be experimenting with the paywall option to post a series of journal entries during my 4 days in Chicago next week at the Democratic National Convention. Sunday night will be a public post as a teaser, and then we'll see how it goes from there. Thank you for listening.